So first, it's always difficult finding really talented folks. And I think that that's something that's general for everyone, not just in startups. Two, though, and I think it is somewhat specific to startups, it's not like culture doesn't exist in other companies too, but in startups, I would say that culture really has a massive influence on things. And especially because startups can be so hard, often it's the culture that actually sets the tone and drives people to continue to do the work even when it's really hard or when funding is, like questionable or any of those things. And then the third is really risk tolerance. And I think that that one is more systemic, and it seems to be, I used to think that it was a personality issue, but I actually think that it has more to do with the education and the expectations of society around what is an appropriate career. And that is changing dramatically. Because I remember when I was starting my company, I love my parents, but my mom, asked me that question, well, when are you going to get a real job, right? And I think that that question is something that, a lot of people that are either starting companies or are involved in early stage companies get from the people that they care about, be that their friends or their parents or whoever it is that they respect. And so I think that there's really this cultural shift that really is starting to happen, and you can definitely see it in the US, in that startups are now very much in vogue and it's kind of the cool thing to do. But how do you match the risk tolerance such that people, when they get involved in startups, are going to be comfortable with what they've actually signed up for? Because the worst thing in the world is having somebody that is really talented and fits the culture, but then when things get hard, and they will, having them freaking out on you, right? Which is never a good thing. And so being able to find somebody that meets all three of those requirements can be very, very difficult. I would say that there is definitely a significant generational difference with the millennial group coming in. One of the biggest things that I've seen is that there's really this drive for authentic and very real connections. And people really want that authenticity and that transparency in a way that hasn't really been demanded by employees in the past. And so I think that for employers, there's this trend of like, well, if you're gonna be really appealing to the millennial generation, you actually have to deal with that, deal with the fact that you can't have all top-down hierarchical decision-making. People want to be involved, they want to know, they want to be able to have insight into like what is the long-term strategic goals of the company. They want to contribute to it. And I think that's part of the reason why you're seeing so many people starting their own thing, because they just don't feel involved anymore. And so if people are going to really retain talent in these larger companies, they're going to have to be able to address the needs and wants of the millennial generation. Biggest challenges for young entrepreneurs in biotech? Wow. There are a ton. One of the biggest ones, I think, is that the market is moving so fast. It's ridiculously fast. If you look at things like, people used to think like that in the computing age, it's like, oh my gosh, the computing age moves so quickly, right? Moore's law, every 18 months, faster, right? But if you look at Carlson's law, or Venter's law, depending who you answer to, which is like the rate at which sequencing is moving forward, it's actually faster than Moore's law. And so if you're an entrepreneur in the biotech sector, like the market is moving from underneath you at a much, much faster rate. And so your requirements to move and to pivot and to adjust based on like this continually like, ebbing and flowing tide is absolutely necessary. So that one is very, very challenging. And I think that being able to communicate that out clearly to the investors and to the other stakeholders, so that way they know that it's going to be a tricky journey, because nobody knows what's going to happen and you can't always anticipate all of the things that are going to come up, that's a huge issue. I think that there's a lot of other issues too, just as a young entrepreneur, because, being a young entrepreneur, first of all, you usually are a first timer, and so there's a ton of things that you just don't know about, right? But I think that on top of that, bio requires such a deep, like, depth of knowledge that some other kinds of companies don't. You know, if you're making an app, you don't need a gigantic depth of knowledge in order to potentially be successful, whereas in bio, you have to. And so there's this interesting thing where you have young entrepreneurs that are very ambitious but don't necessarily have the experience, and so they have to bring in people that have that experience if they're going to succeed. So what's very interesting for me is that I am the youngest person in my company by far. I mean, my first co-founder is 10 years older than me. My second co-founder is 2 decades older than me, right? And so, like, how do you get the trust and the talent of those people? So that way you're not just, you know, a bunch of young folks, like, with a big vision but no experience. I think that that's a major challenge as well. And I think that that really comes down to, because I asked my co-founders, like, why, I was very confused by it for a long time, like, why are you following the 20-something-year-old, right? Because it just made no sense to me, and that was like my own kind of figuring out my own issues thing, right? And ultimately what it came down to, because I finally asked them, I was like, why? It really came down to the vision and the passion and the drive. The one thing that we do have going for us as young entrepreneurs is that we have not been beaten down and told no enough, and so we don't know what's not possible, so we do it, and then people go, oh. And so in that case, naivete plays in our favor, but we have to balance it with the experience issues.